Hi, we're not on the range today, we're at one of our training facilities. So hopefully the only noise you'll have to put up with in the background are the birds and the log trucks going by occasionally. Now recently we did a presentation on my top 5 tips for non-firearms owners who are becoming firearms owners because of our current situation. And somehow the title of that became our top 10 tips. Well, rather than change that, we decided to do 5 more tips and call it Top 10 Tips Part 2. Now in that, fair warning, just about all I'm going to do today is talk, and you'll have to put up with my Shatner-esque pauses and everything else. Also, before we get into our tips 6 through 10, there are 3 things I need to address from Part 1. There were several things that I thought I made very clear, and based on the commentary, I can see that I failed in that attempt. So we had a lot of commentary from people offering their advice on how new firearms owners should take classes, get professional training, go to a gun store that has a range and rent guns so basically you can test drive them, get a lot of practice on indoor ranges, buy a lot of ammo, and all of that would be very good advice under normal conditions. Right now, these are not normal conditions. A lot of firearm stores are closed. A lot of those ranges are closed. A lot of those classes are not in session. A lot of gun stores that have ammunition, they're out of certain types, and sometimes they're only selling limited amounts. So all that practice people should be doing, they don't have the opportunity to do. So all that would have been good advice a few months ago, it doesn't apply to a lot of people now. The second thing is, we had a lot of people asking many different versions of the same question, which was some type of, why would you buy a firearm to deal with a virus? Okay, I think that question was asked by a lot of people who were venting their frustration over their failings in their attempts to deal with billy goats. And to those people I would say, I feel for you and your frustration, but don't take it out on me. And if you want to waste your time, I can't stop you from doing that, but it's really selfish of you to waste everybody else's time with such things. But for those very few people who were asking that question sincerely, let me see if I can make it a little clearer. Throughout the world, different countries have different things going on right now, but specifically here in the United States, things are going fairly well. There's people out of work, there's shortages of toilet paper, but for the most part, things are going fairly well. However, there are members of our society who perceive the possibility that our situation might take a turn for the worse. And they perceive that we might end up with gasoline shortages, food shortages. Various things that we take for granted might not be available. For example, right now the place where I get my hair cut is not in business. And believe me, no one wants to see the results of me cutting it myself. But we might see in the near future, if things go really downhill, that things like the fire department will be overwhelmed or non-existent. The police department might be overwhelmed or non-existent. And so there are people in our society who have previously not been firearms owners who are now becoming firearms owners because of the possibility that things might go very badly, and with no police to counter it, there might be a lot more crime. With no grocery stores, people might just want to kill you to take your food, and they want to be able to protect themselves and their loved ones. Now, personally, I don't think the situation here in the U.S. will get that bad, but I can't completely rule it out. For example, I don't think my house is going to burn down, but I have fire insurance. Driving here today, I didn't think I would get a flat tire, and I didn't, but I still have a jack, a lug wrench, and a spare. Sometimes being prepared for things is a good idea. Now, I am not encouraging and I'm not discouraging any course of action. But for those people who have previously not been firearms owners, and now because of the situation think they should be, these are some things that I think can help you. Now, the third thing I want to address is all the people who had a lot of creative things to say about the various ways I should harm myself with the guns I'm talking about. Okay, those kind of things are funny and the crew and I get a good laugh out of them. However, when you're the 40th person to suggest that I shoot myself, it's no longer funny. It just demonstrates a lack of creativity and imagination on your part. So if you want to say comedic things like that, guys, you really got to step up your game. Okay, all of that having been said, let's get started with our top 10 tips for new firearms owners, 6 through 10. Now, we discussed this briefly in part 1, but point 6 is obey your local laws. There are some people who are concerned that if the current situation goes really downhill, we might end up in a condition that some people call WROL, that's without rule of law. And if that happens, you'll know it when you get there. But before people start shaving their head into mohawks and trying to murder Mel Gibson, obey your local laws. And in that, there's 2 very important things to understand. One is you have to understand that firearms laws can vary greatly from one jurisdiction to another. For example, occasionally I'll stand here and I'll talk about deer hunting with a handgun, and there will be people who will send me hate mail telling me about the fact that that's illegal. Well, it might be in whatever jurisdiction they're in. It's perfectly legal in the state that I live in. You have to understand that firearms laws can vary greatly from one jurisdiction to the next. The second thing is you must familiarize yourself with your local laws, and not just the words on the page of the statute, but how those laws are interpreted by law enforcement. Let me give you an example. I moved into a different state and I wanted to familiarize myself with local firearms laws, so I call an attorney. He tells me I can read the statute for myself, and I said, but I want to make sure that I understand how they're interpreted. And he told me a bunch of things, but one of the things he told me was that in that particular state, it's unlawful to have a loaded firearm in a vehicle, unless of course you have a permit. Okay, I understand the word loaded, but he went on to explain to me that if you have a firearm that utilizes detachable box magazines, if you have that firearm somewhere in the car and you have a magazine with rounds in it in the car as well, even though your firearm is not what I would consider loaded, that the police would arrest you on the charge of loaded firearm in a car. Now, he went on to explain that the district attorney typically loses those cases in court, but that doesn't stop the police from making an arrest. Now, that tells us 2 very important things. One, that the way law enforcement interprets the word loaded and the way I interpret it are 2 different things. And 2, it tells us something about the mentality of law enforcement in that jurisdiction. Let me show you another example. In the state in which I currently reside, we do not have a specific prohibition on shooting from a motor vehicle. You're not allowed to shoot from or across a public roadway. You're not allowed to hunt from a motor vehicle. But if you were off the road in a place where it's legal to shoot and you wanted to sit in the cab of your pickup and shoot out the window at a target so you're avoiding being in the rain, you can do that. But in this jurisdiction where I was talking to the attorney, he explained to me that they have a specific prohibition on shooting from a motor vehicle. Now, I think I know what that means, but he goes on to explain that if you drive out to somewhere like the National Forest where it's perfectly legal to shoot, and you do something that people have done for as long as there's been pickups, use the hood as an impromptu bench rest, that the police might very well arrest you and charge you with the crime of shooting from a motor vehicle. And he told me that the district attorney typically loses those cases in court, but that won't stop the police from making that arrest. And again, it tells us 2 things. One, that shooting from a motor vehicle means something entirely different to me than it does to the police. And 2, it tells us a little bit about the mentality of law enforcement in that particular jurisdiction. One more thing I want to discuss on the topic of following your local laws is the concept of borrowing a firearm. To a lot of non-firearms enthusiasts who now think they might need one for a while, it will make sense to them to just borrow a firearm from a friend who has quite a few of them. And that might make sense, but different jurisdictions can have a wide variety of laws and regulations governing who can and can't, or when you can and can't, borrow a firearm from someone. Make sure you understand your local laws. Point 7 on the list is creating a balance between access and security of a firearm. When you're carrying a firearm or having one in your house for home defense, you have to be able to get to that firearm quickly for it to do you any good. But at the same time, you have to take reasonable precautions to make sure that people who shouldn't get to it don't get to it. Now, I read some kind of news story where a woman was carrying her pistol in her purse. By the way, ladies, we have a presentation on purse carry. Please watch that. And somehow this woman's toddler got in that purse, got access to the pistol, and negligently discharged it. And we also have a presentation on the most common types of negligent discharges. Please watch that. You have to keep that firearm accessible, but not to people that shouldn't have access to it. Now, let me tell you an anecdote. Long time ago, I was dating some girl that lived with her parents, and one day my friend Joe and I went over there. And by the way, for those just tuning in, Joe is a very real person. I just changed his name. Well, Joe had just purchased a Beretta 92 FS, and he had it with him, and we go over there. And my girlfriend's father also has a 92 FS, and he wants to show it off. And he proudly proclaims that, quote, "I keep it loaded in the safe for home defense," close quote. Well, he leaves the room to go get this gun out of the safe, and with my short attention span, I quickly went off to something else. But about 10 minutes later, he comes back without the gun, and he says to his wife, "Honey, can you open the safe for me? I can never get into that thing." So she goes and opens the safe for him, and a few minutes later, he brings back the pistol, unloaded. And I'm looking at this pistol, and it is immaculate. And I'm thinking, wow, this thing looks like it's never been fired. And right about then, he again proudly proclaims, "Never been fired." Okay. Now, because I was dating his daughter, I wasn't in a position to tell him the two things I really wanted to tell him. But you've got to have some awareness of the balance between accessibility and security. His pistol was so secure he had it in a safe that he couldn't open himself. Now, if you have people in your home like children who shouldn't have access to a firearm, there are some safes you can buy that are really little, made to hold just one handgun. Now, they're not made to keep the firearm from being stolen. Someone could just pick up the entire safe. They're made to keep the firearm from being accessed by people who shouldn't access it. And a lot of these will have a matrix on the top of the safe that looks like a hand, and you put your hand in there and then you hit index, pinky, thumb, and it pops the safe open. And you can have fairly rapid access to your handgun if you've practiced it, but it can keep people who shouldn't have access from having access, and that's something to really look at. But you have to evaluate your personal situation. Do you have toddlers? Are you the supervisor for someone we call a PINS, that's person in need of supervision? Who is going to be in your home? And you have to evaluate that and create a balance between accessibility and security. Point 8 on the list is learn everything you can about the firearm you've purchased. When I talk about the man who's proud that he's never fired it, okay, it is a Beretta, it is a high-quality firearm, but it doesn't matter if it's a Beretta or a Glock or a SIG or a Colt. If you've never fired it, you don't really know for sure that it'll even work. If at all possible, you've got to get out there and shoot that firearm. Now, we talk about professional training and classes and going to the range, and those are great ideas if you have access to them, and right now a lot of people don't. But if you have a friend who has private property, even if you have to drive 100 miles to get to the national forest where you can shoot that firearm, check your local laws, you must do that if at all possible. But even if you have very limited access to the range, there's a lot of things you can learn by working with your firearm at home. You can practice disassembly and reassembly. You can practice taking the magazine out and learning where the magazine release is. You can practice changing magazines. And when you do things like this, you must always use dummy ammunition. Never use live ammo at home. You can buy dummies or snap caps, because when you're practicing your mag change and your finger negligently gets on the trigger, and while you're doing that you hear that, okay, you've just learned something when it clicked. You learned about straight trigger finger. And you want to learn that the good way by hearing the click, not the hard way by putting a hole through your television set. Never practice with live ammunition unless you're in a place where you can safely and legally discharge that firearm. Now, when I talk about learning your firearm, right now I absolutely know there's no round in the chamber of this handgun. I know that because I didn't put a round in the chamber. I can feel the loaded chamber indicator telling me that the chamber's empty, but I'm still going to do a press check before I put that pistol back in my pocket. You must learn everything you can about the firearm you buy and practice safety at all times. Number 9 on my list is that you must familiarize yourself with the rules of engagement. Now, this comes with a couple of very important disclaimers. First, as I've said so many times, laws can vary from one jurisdiction to another. You have to familiarize yourself with your local laws. Secondly, I am not an attorney. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not giving you any legal advice. If I were to give anyone legal advice, it would be the advice of seek advice from an attorney. Now, that having been said, here in the United States, the concept of self-defense is based on the notion that citizens can use force up to and including deadly force if you reasonably believe that you or another innocent person is in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm. Now let's break that down. First, reasonable. I'm going to come back to that. Second, believe. You know, you're not really required to actually be in danger. You must reasonably believe that you're in danger. There are many cases of police officers, unfortunately, shooting people who are armed with toy guns. What can you do? Someone points a very realistic-looking toy. That police officer believed he was in danger, and most of the time that belief was reasonable. If I were standing here right now and somebody decided to play a really stupid prank on me and they were 100 yards away and started shooting at me with blanks, I wouldn't know that they were blanks. And if I were to then shoot back at that person, it wouldn't matter so much that I wasn't actually in danger, that I believed I was in danger. But that belief must be reasonable and prudent. Now, what is reasonable? That's open to a lot of interpretation. That's why we have court systems and juries. But if someone were 100 yards away from me armed with an aluminum baseball bat and he was waving it around yelling at me that he was going to kill me, it wouldn't really be reasonable for me to think that someone that far away poses an imminent threat to me. You must reasonably believe that you're in imminent danger. Now, I talk about that you or another innocent person. Okay. If uniformed police officers are shooting at an armed assailant, you would have no desire to help that person, obviously. But even if for whatever weird reason you wanted to, it's not an innocent person. But on the other side of that, if you were walking out of the grocery store and you had 2 bags of groceries and that same guy with the aluminum baseball bat came up and hit you and knocked you down and then walked up and brought the bat up like he's going to cave your skull in, well, I'm not in any danger, but you, another innocent person, are in imminent danger, and I would be allowed to come to your aid. Now, that brings us back to the concept of imminent danger. The example of the person who's 100 yards away with the ball bat, that's not imminent. If someone called you on the phone and told you, hey, tomorrow I'm going to come over and kill you, yeah, that doesn't mean you get to drive over to his house and shoot him through the window. It has to be imminent. If that guy with the ball bat were not 100 yards away but 5 yards away, all of a sudden that would be imminent. Now, when we talk about these distances, that brings up the subject of the 7-yard thing. Now, this takes a moment to explain. Please bear with me. In 1970, there was a very famous shooting called the Newhall shooting and the Newhall incident. On the heels of that, the FBI did a lot of study on police shootings, and one of the things they came up with was that the mean distance at which a police officer shoots at a suspect was 7 yards. Now, in a completely unrelated thing, there was another study that dealt with the idea of police officers who were facing knife-wielding assailants. And a study showed that if a police officer was standing there, pistol in his holster, and a knife-wielding assailant was 7 yards away and then charged that police officer who had to key on that movement, that the assailant with the knife could close that 7 yards, touch that man with the knife before that police officer could get his holstered pistol into action. And so it became a standard that if a police officer was facing a knife-wielding assailant who was less than 7 yards away, that is imminent danger. Now, how that standard is applied to citizens, that can be different in different jurisdictions. But what all this 7-yard stuff has done is it's allowed some people to erroneously think that imminent danger is only if someone is 7 yards away. And that isn't a legal standard anywhere that I'm aware of. Again, if someone were some distance from me shooting at me, the fact that he's over 7 yards away does not make him safe from me defending myself. I read a story about a police officer who had just finished his shift and was driving home in uniform, and he was ambushed. When he pulled up to his house, someone shot him from about 35 yards away. Unfortunately, that police officer was killed in that altercation, but he would have absolutely been authorized to defend himself. The fact that the assailant was 35 yards away doesn't mean that he isn't in imminent danger. I think the fact that he was killed makes it quite clear that he was in imminent danger. When I do presentations like this, I frequently demonstrate shooting handguns at 25 or 50 yards. And I am frequently inundated with comments telling me that you can't defend yourself at a distance of that much. If you did, you would be in the wrong. There is no distance that I'm aware of attached to this. Now, granted, citizen-involved shootings, citizen-involved cases of self-defense are far more likely to happen at a distance of 5 yards than 50, but there is no distance standard to defending yourself. So, reasonable belief that you or another innocent person are in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm. Now, death is pretty self-explanatory. What about serious bodily harm? Well, while we're talking about knife-wielding assailants, what if someone were wielding a little knife like this? Well, if you're a particularly rotund person, it's not likely this person's going to stab you in the abdomen and hit anything vital. Probably wouldn't go through the chest and hit anything vital. But a little knife like this, someone could slit your throat, poke you in the eye, cut major blood vessels, cut tendons or nerves. Serious bodily harm could be done. Now, if you are 6'4", you weigh 250 pounds, most of it's muscle, and you are accosted by a 5', 300-pound crackhead with a little knife like that, the idea that you had to resort to using your gun, many people in a jury might not consider that reasonable. And there are a million different scenarios, and I could talk about this subject for days. But that's the basics of citizens defending themselves. And I would ask everyone to do 3 things. 1, talk to your local attorney. 2, please don't clutter the comment section with all kinds of what-ifs. Unless 3, you happen to be an attorney, then we would all very much like to hear from you. So we've talked about learning your firearm and local laws and all those kinds of things. But remember, these are our top 10 tips for purchasing firearms. So let's get back to that. Point 10 is be aware of the hidden costs that go with purchasing and operating firearms. Let me show you an example. This is a Sig Sauer M17 caliber 9x19. This is a Ruger 5.7 caliber 5.7 by 28. If you buy either of these firearms, you might notice they have a fairly similar price tag. They also both come with 2 magazines, this with 2 17-shot magazines, this with 2 20-shot magazines. Now, for either of these handguns, 2 magazines will be plenty for just about anything you'd ever need to do. But extra magazines can be quite expensive depending on what firearm you purchase. For this Ruger 5.7, when I bought an extra magazine at the store, it was $40. There's also the price of ammunition. 5.7 by 28 ammo can have a price tag that's well over double the price of 9x19 ammunition, and you've got to be aware of those hidden costs. Let me show you another example. Here's an AR platform rifle. This is an A1, kind of an old school version of an AR platform. And it has a carrying handle, and your rear sight assembly is part of that. It also has a front sight assembly. Some of the newer versions of AR platform rifles have removable carrying handles and removable front sight assemblies. The idea is that you can purchase aftermarket sights or some kind of optic that you can put on here, and then of course you remove the front sight assembly so it's not in the way of the optic. And those can be very good options for some people. However, some versions of these rifles, when you buy them, they don't come with any sights. So you look at the price tag on the rifle and you think that's reasonable until you realize it doesn't come with sights. You have to purchase those separately. And depending on what you buy, they might cost hundreds of dollars. You've got to be aware of the hidden costs that come with purchasing some firearms. This is a Ruger 1022 rifle, caliber 22 long rifle. And someone might try to sell you something like this on the idea that it's rugged, it's durable, it's reliable, it's accurate, it's inexpensive, and you can put a lot of rounds downrange because of this cool 25-shot magazine. Yeah, except that when you buy it, it doesn't come with that 25-shot magazine. When you buy it, it comes with this 10-shot magazine, which is okay, but all of a sudden it isn't quite as cool as the 25. You have to be aware of the added costs of aftermarket things, and sometimes these magazines can be very expensive. Now, this rifle has a flash suppressor on it. In this particular case, when this was purchased new, it came with the flash suppressor. But sometimes salesmen will try to sell you aftermarket things. Now, whether a flash suppressor is necessary and whether or not it does any good on a rifle that's caliber 22 long rifle, that's debatable. But sometimes salesmen will try to sell you folding stocks, pistol grip forestocks, rail systems, the list goes on ad astra. Some accoutrements like that can be very useful for some people in some circumstances. Some accoutrements like that are of no more value than when a salesman tries to sell you the extended warranty on a toaster. You have to be aware of the hidden costs of firearms and the notion that salesmen might try to sell you stuff that you don't really need. So points 6 through 10 were: obey your local laws, create a balance between rapid access to your firearm and secure storage, learn as much about your firearm as you can, understand the rules of engagement, and beware of the hidden costs of firearms and the things salesmen might try to sell you that you don't really need. So, if you've sat through this entire presentation, thank you for your attention, and thanks for watching the top 10 tips for non-firearms owners that are now buying firearms video, part 2.